Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. Chapter 10. This chapter is not the happy ending. Please proceed with care. 7 years later. The cold woke Hermione first. That the chilly air had penetrated the flannel sheets didn't bode well for what was awaiting her beyond the confines of her bed. She snuggled down deeper into the pillow, tucking her nose under the blanket and trying for a return to unconsciousness. But her rustling had woken her bedfellow. Or perhaps he'd already been awake. Draco was a poor sleeper on the best days, turning in late, resting fitfully and rising early. He only lingered when he wanted something. And his arm snaked around her waist and pulled her close. She knew immediately what that something was. His erection pressed firmly against her bum. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" she murmured. His breath puffed against her bare neck, followed by the press of his lips. Hermione kept her hair short now, her once wide curls smoothed into waves by a pixie cut, which she diligently trimmed whenever she started to recognize herself. "Fire burned out last night," Draco said. "My fault. Didn't feed it enough." "So this is selfish," she teased. "You were cold and wanted to get warm." "No, this is noble. You were shivering and I wanted to warm you." His hand drifted from her stomach to her breast, his fingers finding her left nipple and teasing it to a peak. "How am I doing?" She shifted her ear against him. "I've had better." He tweaked her nipple, then trailed his hand back down her body. He loosened the drawstring tie of her cotton pajama pants with a single pull and worked his hand beneath the elastic. Hermione rolled half onto her back to open her legs and let him explore. She closed her eyes and drifted, losing herself in the sensation. Her name, a whisper, a warning, but above all, a secret. Hermione. She felt herself tighten around him, the pressure welling, the muscles of her core on her hair triggered set to explode. "Again," she whispered. "Hermione." His fingers pressed into her skin off her hips, rocking her forward and back, increasing the friction, the tempo. She clenched around him as a second orgasm overtook her, wiping away everything but him. The sour taste of his skin, the musk of his release, the strength of his arm. The way he said her name. How he risked it for her. How they risked it for each other. Because that's what this was. Time stolen in a world from which they'd chosen to disconnect. The destruction of the Order had indeed been its death now, and Voldemort's ascendance was completed soon after. Their names, their true identities, were hidden by necessity but bared to each other in these moments of intimacy, where she at least could embrace who she was and what she'd done while remaining separate from the guilt of it. In her new life, Hermione didn't crusade for the rights of others or fight against a pernicious evil. She was just a young woman who worked in the Helmsday Café, quite bookish and little sad. People called her Jean, if they knew her name at all, and Draco, Lewis now, was no longer a man held hostage by powers he couldn't overcome. He had joined a fishing boat crew, earning calluses on his palms and the respect of his crewmates. They had hidden there once beneath a stone in front of their shared hearth. They had found no reason to draw them. Magic no longer had a presence in their life. At least not the type they'd grown up knowing. The magic they claimed now was found in each other, in how they came together when every inch of her pressed against every inch of him, and how they separated when Hermione would cook breakfast and Draco would head out back to split wood for the fire. And how they lived as an ordinary couple with pasts they didn't discuss and a future they tried not to plan. Hermione rested her head up on Draco's shoulder, skin prickling with goose flesh as he trailed his fingers up and down her back. "How much longer?" Hermione looked between them, at the bulge just beginning to show. This was part of their unplanned future. A calculation error that neither of them had the heart to undo. They didn't talk about it often. It felt dangerous, like acknowledging the truth would also doom it. But she felt safe in his arms, ignoring a flutter of fear, and what she thought was fear. Hermione answered him. 6 months, give or take. Go on borrowed time until she comes. We've been on borrowed time for years. Draco pressed a kiss into her neck and breathed his words into her skin. "At what point do we start doing it?" As if in reply, the room's pressure shifted, withdrawing. A vacuum. A moment. There was time enough for one last glance, a final second of peace. Hermione hoped he knew how grateful she was for everything he'd given her. Then the time for hope ended. The heavy wooden door exploded inward with the sound of a shipwreck. Splinters as long as her forearms sliced the air as the life they'd built imploded. Draco rolled them back, gliding out of her as they hit the floor. "Fuck!" Draco clutched his right shoulder and pressed over a shallow scrape oozing blood. Hermione's stomach rolled. "We're okay," she lied. "Ones we need." They were hidden too close to the destroyed door. Draco's hand landed heavy on her shoulder. He shook his head. "We can't." Ever practical, this man she loved, she took his hand. "We deserved more time." "You'll get it." He squeezed her fingers hard as the storm in his eyes settled into stone. "Draco, no!" "On my own terms," he said. How they'd lived, how he'd died. "Run!" Draco spun on bare knees, gripped the bottom of the bed and heaved. The thick oak frame slammed onto its side edge, rattling the windows. Hermione sprinted towards the back door, vaulting over the kitchen table and tipping chairs in her wake. A hex went wide, exploding their sink, spewing water into the heart of their home. A high-pitched cackle sent ice down her spine. Familiar bellow, abruptly silenced, tore a sob from her throat. Hermione stumbled into the boat room and fell to her knees before an old trunk. She scrabbled at the ledge, hardly feeling the snap of fragile fingernails. Her sealskin lay at the bottom, folded and forgotten. Never stolen, never hidden. Simply stored for later she prayed would never come. She grabbed it, then yelped as a curse punched through the wall above her. Plaster rained onto her head, and the vicious taunts of the Death Eater hit squad grew clearer.
"Come, kiss your blood-traitor husband goodbye. He's got one less smile just for you."
Murder rose within her. Hermione did not need a wand. She could rip these monsters apart with her teeth and sate her rage with the taste of their blood. Didn't matter if she lived as long as they died with her. But it did matter. Because of the decision in Draco's eyes. Because of his last desperate request. Because of his sacrifice made to give her, to give them more time. Hermione gathered herself, found her feet in a crouch and dashed towards the seat. Sharp rocks against the soles of her feet, warm cloak against her back, breathless lungs as she hit the frigid water. Curses plinked against the ocean surface, changing course, going wide, fizzling away. All grew quiet. Hermione cut through the water like a dull knife, clumsy and heavy with grief. She'd lived in the small fishing village of Helmsdale, Scotland, for 7 years with a man she'd never thought to love. She'd learned his skin better than she knew her own. The flat lines of his chest, the crests of his scars, the valley between his brows. He was her safe harbor in the post-war turbulence, an easy current she could drift up on through their routine days, and an anchor when the riptide of memory threatened to drown her. What Hermione had once found in the sea she had discovered in Draco. And now, Draco was gone. The part of her that had yearned for freedom, which ached for flight and purpose and the grand ideation of youth, had been worn smooth. What had felt so fierce in her youth had fallen victim to time and tide. Hermione had made peace with that. There was no shame in a simple life, no disgrace in domesticity. She could look back on all those years spent fighting, travelling, and hoping with nostalgia, sad that it ended, comfortable that those days were past. Except they weren't. Here were old longings, fulfilled and bittered by the death of the men she loved. Here was the sea, smelling of petrol and algae and rotten things, offering none of its former comfort. Here was her future, spent wandering the cold void, alone save for the heart that beat beside her own. The end. Thank you for listening to Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or Ao3.